Very special thanks to Cardiff Trade Sales for providing the vehicle in this review. Of course, if you're in the market for one of these exactly, or maybe something else, such as the cars that I've reviewed before with them, and maybe even something that's on the lower end of the daily driver market even, then check out their stock. I've linked to their website down in the video description, where you can check out everything that they're currently selling. Those of you who have been watching Beards and Cars for some time will probably remember that a few months ago I featured a very impressive diesel GT car. In fact, it was another 6 Series, the previous generation in fact, the 635d. This is the natural and certainly worthy successor to that car, the 640d. And for those of you who did watch that review, you will doubtless remember that I showered that car with praise, because in my opinion it was a nearly perfect all-round GT car. It looked great, had fantastic fuel economy, really good performance for what it was, the used prices are good, the space is good, etc. It was a genuinely usable daily GT car. There were, however, a couple of notable drawbacks, not so much on the side of practicality, but more on the side of it being a GT. One of those was it didn't sound all that great, and the second thing was it wasn't quite charismatic enough for a GT car. So yes, it was a fantastic practical choice, of course with great fuel economy, but it didn't necessarily have the wow factor or the fun factor of, for instance, my GT of choice, a Jag XKR. I'm very pleased to say though that this car has now ticked those boxes as well, because for everything great about the 635d, this is an even better car. Now, in terms of generations, of course this was the replacement. Now technically BMW gives different designations in terms of like Mark 1, Mark 2, etc. to the convertible and the hardtop. That's a bit of a weird way of doing it in my opinion, considering that they're basically the same car but one has an open roof, but for whatever reason that's the way they like to do it. So technically the car that I drove last time was an E64 generation, since the E63 is the hardtop and I drove the convertible. This time around, this is the F generation, F12 and F13. The F12 being the convertible this time, so the car that I'm in here is an F13 Generation 6 Series. Now in terms of some of its specs, it's actually surprisingly similar to that previous car. It still has a 3-litre 6-cylinder turbo-aspirated engine. So where's the improvement? Is it just a facelift with a new name? Is it genuinely better? And if so, why am I saying that it's better than an already brilliant car? To the point where I made a pretty strong potential claim in the thumbnail of the video about this being a perfect GT car. How on earth could a diesel GT be perfect? Well, let me explain. That 3-litre engine is tuned higher than the previous car would be. The power, especially the torque, is way higher. In fact, it has some interesting numbers compared to my car, the Touareg V10, also of course in the high-performance diesel category. For example, this car puts out 313 brake horsepower, which sounds good, but not necessarily amazing. The torque, on the other hand, well, that's where it's at. 465 pound-feet of torque is very high. In fact, that would be high for a conventional, for instance, V8 GT car, let alone a much smaller 6-cylinder, significantly lower in the range model. But get this, the performance on this car is fantastic. Now, the quoted on-paper 0 to 60 is 5.5 seconds. In reality, you're looking at more like 5.2. And of course it's speed limited to 155 miles an hour, but the key thing there is that acceleration, because driving this car was such a fun experience. The acceleration in this thing, it felt, and this is one of the highest praises I can give to a car, it felt almost like an electric vehicle. It was that fast. Now, of course that sounds ridiculous to say that a conventional engine can have that kind of acceleration, but there are different ways of delivering acceleration, and the way that this car does was deeply impressive. And it's all about that torque. And unlike, for instance, slightly older high-performance diesel, even my high-performance V10, for example, it suffers from some lag. You put your foot down, then the turbos spool up, then you get going. The way that this car delivers its acceleration actually reminded me a lot of the Supra that I drove. The 90s iconic Supra with that kind of multi-stage sequential turbo which it has, which gives you just this rush of acceleration, which is so fun to feel. And to liken a BMW Diesel 6 Series from around 2012 to something as iconic as the 90s 2JZ Supra will be sacrilegious to many JDM fans, maybe even some petrol heads in general, but I honestly think that that is one of the most accurate comparisons I can make. It sounds similar to that car, the performance is remarkably similar, the power delivery certainly is, and even the fun factor really did remind me of that Supra. So initially, just talking performance, it's clearly heads above that previous 635d. That was already a great car, but it was great in a very of its time kind of way. Hot hatch levels of 0 to 60, good levels of power and torque, but not necessarily anything crazy. This car, on the other hand, well, you've got Touareg V10 horsepower straight off the bat. The torque can exceed many petrol GT V8 cars, for instance, and the acceleration is on par with something like my Maserati. Across the board, those are good numbers for a diesel. But of course, you can't talk about a diesel without referring to stuff like practicality. So let's talk tax and fuel. The, for some, less exciting aspect of these reviews, but I think a hugely important one, and in the case of this car, a very impressive one, because the tax on this thing is £165 a year here in the UK. I wish I could pay £165 on my car, because to put that into perspective, my Touareg, which is about the same in terms of power, does have more torque, certainly a more exotic engine, but of course isn't as quick as this, I pay £580 a year tax because of its emissions. This, once again, is £165. That's insane. Then of course, we can talk fuel economy, because this is very impressive in that regard. Now, the previous 635d was already great in that way, and one of the biggest recommendations that I gave in that review was, of course, to give it a remap, or at least a tuning box, such as my car has. It makes such a tangible difference to a diesel car, even more so than a chip would to a petrol car, because yes, you get more power, you get way more torque, but you even get a significant jump in fuel economy, as well as better acceleration, and potentially even top speed as well. In the case of this car, well, imagine what a remap would do. Power would probably be up to something like 340, 350 horsepower at least, and the torque would be probably pretty close to that Touareg V10, well over 500 pound-feet easily, and although I haven't double-checked those numbers, it wouldn't surprise me at all if you'd be looking at maybe 530, 540 pound-feet with a remap. Or to give you some real-world perspective on how much torque that really is, that means that this car with a remap would quite comfortably be putting out more torque than a Viper SRT10, one of the largest engine cars on the road, compared to this, a 3-litre 6-cylinder. But let's get back to that fuel economy for just a second, because across the board this is even an improvement over that already impressive 635d. The city rating is 42 miles per gallon. That's already great. For a GT car, that already blows most petrol GTs clear out of the water. On the highway, you're looking at 60 miles per gallon, or a fraction under, and even combined, its combined fuel cycle averages out to about 50 to 51 miles per gallon. That is crazy. Now, I don't care if you're a fan of diesels, you simply have to respect that engineering. To have a car with the power of a Touareg V10, the torque of a Dodge Viper, the 0 to 60 time of a Maserati Quattroporte, the top end speed potentially of something like a Jag XK without the limiter, and the fuel economy of, well, something like a Ford Ecotec hatchback, all combined into a genuine, stunning looking GT. Now let's get to the looks, because I just mentioned that it is a stunning car, and it certainly is. In terms of appearance, that's always the most subjective thing, of course, about any review. Do you like it? Do you dislike it? For me, I always preferred that previous generation. It had a very shark-like appearance. I love the look of that V10 M6, and to me that's still the coolest version of the M6. In terms of normal 6 Series though, well, now that I've seen this one up close and personal and driven one, I think this might actually be an even nicer looking car, and there's one key difference that I think makes me feel that way, and that is something which I talked about with a couple of other cars as well, such as the Porsche Panamera or the Aston Martin Vanquish, and that is road presence. There are certain vehicles which look good, but they don't necessarily catch your attention. There are other cars that dominate the scene. When that car pulls up, you notice it. This is one of those cars. The Mercedes SL is another perfect example. It's just got a lot of presence. It's a big, imposing, look at me kind of car. This has that as well. It looks even more exotic than it actually is, and if for instance you chose to debadge it, as this one is, no one would guess that it was a diesel. Now let's talk about those two downsides that I referenced with the 635D, because that is what I referenced at the start of this video, and is crucial to why I believe this is, objectively speaking, in other words, devoid of personal opinion and just down to facts, a perfect GT car. And I believe that strongly. That's not just a gimmick for the sake of getting some views. The two biggest downsides I said about that previous car were it didn't sound that great. In fact, it didn't sound like much at all. And it wasn't that charismatic. And that's kind of the problem with the diesel. Well, it ain't the problem anymore, because BMW did a fantastic job with this generation. Just one generation separate, with the same size engine, they've managed to change so much about the car. The sound, for example, is even better than that previous vehicle. Now, I haven't looked into whether or not they piped some fake sounds into the car like they did with the i8, so maybe they did do something like that, but either way, it sounds categorically better than the previous car did, that's for sure. In terms of charisma, well, I think you can kind of tell from my review that I had a lot more fun in this car than I did in that 635D. To me, the biggest difference between these two is that that was an academically impressive GT car. This is just an impressive GT car. So it goes beyond just the numbers. In the case of this one, it's got all of the numbers that 635D had. This has the great fuel economy, the great tax, the great acceleration, the torque, the power. But this one also has the fun factor. It has so much more personality than that previous car had, and even though that one's still great in its own way, and is still, and this is one of the biggest advantages of that previous generation, a little bit cheaper than this one. You can, for instance, buy one of those for about 7-8 grand, whereas this one you're looking more like 12 or 13 for a private seller. This particular model that I'm driving is just under 20 grand, and the reason why is the mileage is very, very low. So yes, the prices are different, but in my opinion, this level of spec and this level of car and quality and feel for that money is still pretty remarkable. Another thing about the car that makes it so good is actually the weight. See, in terms of practicality and space and daily usability, which of course is something I always love to talk about, be it a GT or a wagon or an SUV, whatever the case may be, this car is bigger than that previous vehicle. Now, the 635D wasn't a small car. It was already comfortable. This one is larger though, and it especially feels larger in terms of width. And the interior was a really nice place to be. In fact, some of the design reminded me more of the i8, which of course I'm a massive fan of. It had a little bit more flair to it. It's got the stitching running up the dashboard, the redesigned steering wheel, very i8 reminiscent gear selector, which I'm a huge fan of as well. And even the fact that they chose to have, instead of analog speedo and rev gauges, a digital projection of an analog speedo, which kind of looks cool. It's a little bit sci-fi looking. Nothing mind-blowing, of course, but just nice little details and touches, which, as I've said before, make that interior a nice place to be, which to me is a big deal in any car. In terms of daily usability, well, of course, I already mentioned the fuel economy and the tax. Those are fantastic, even if you live in a city. In terms of trunk space, it's very good, and both this and the previous 6 Series have that in common. For a GT, they do have really good trunk space, and the interior rear space is really good as well. Some GTs, Astons for example, they might technically be a 2+2. A Porsche 911 is another perfect example. It technically has 4 seats, but not really. The rear seats are so small and cramped that only really a kid could fit back there. In the case of a 6 Series, well, it's more like a Bentley Continental GT or a Jag XK, where those rear seats are genuinely usable and more than big enough for actual people to sit in them. So overall, if it wasn't already clear, I think this is a brilliant car. Not just a good one or a great one, I think this is a genius level GT machine. And I'm saying that as somebody who isn't a huge BMW fan. I respect and like plenty of their cars, but I'm not a fanboy of the brand by any stretch. So if someone like me can still say that about this car, that should tell you something. It goes without saying that if you get the chance to test drive one of these, definitely take the opportunity. If you're even looking at a 635D, turn your attention to this one, because everything you will love about that car, this one does even better. And to me, what was already a great car in that form is, objectively speaking, perfect in this one. But overall, that's it for my thoughts. Are you a current 640d owner, or have you driven or owned one in the past? Tell me about it down below. What did you think? Did you love the car? Do you agree with me? Did you maybe have some downsides that you'd like to share with other viewers? Of course, all of that is beneficial to hear. And if you are new to the series, be sure to check out that 635d review, as well as the others that you could see annotated on screen when I mentioned them. And of course, if you want to just check out all of my previous reviews, click the playlist here on screen. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.